And there we go. So welcome everyone to today's Green Living Seminar webinar. As I just noted, so this presentation is being recorded, and if you'd like to watch this or other Green Living Seminar presentations, please see the MCLA Environmental Studies YouTube channel. I am Elena Traster, Chair of the Environmental Studies Department. And so this semester's Green Living Seminar is organized around the theme of environmental pollution. And due to the spread of the coronavirus, all remaining presentations this semester are transitioning to video conferences so that we can all participate remotely. They're, as always, free and open to the public. And our presentation should last about 45 minutes with an opportunity to ask questions at the end. Right now, I've closed the chat box so that it's not distracting, but I will open it at the end of the presentation for participants to contribute their questions. And I would like to ask if everyone besides our presenter could mute their microphones so that we can limit the extra noise. I will do the same. So a quick announcement for next week's presentation webinar on Thursday, April 2nd. Nina Schock, Executive Director and Chief Scientific Officer with the Adirondack Center for Loon Conservation, will give a lecture titled Conservation Through the Lives of Adirondack Loons. As I think you all know, today's presentation on PCBs in the Housatonic River will be given by Jim Murphy, previous public affairs specialist with the USA-EPA. And we are really grateful that he is here and willing to go with the flow and do this webinar. So thank you. I'll turn it over to you, Jim.
Okay, so before I put on my screen, well, maybe I will try that so I don't have to worry about it once I start talking. Can you see my screen at this point?
Not yet. I think you'll, oh, yeah, there it is.
Okay.
Oh, it showed up for a moment.
Oh, it showed up and it disappeared.
Yeah, so I think you have to share, present desktop, and then I think there's one more click through.
Okay. And now I will need to, I'm going to give it a second.
Yeah, looks like it's loading.
Hi, this is Jane Nguyen. There were 8 of us trapped somewhere else, and we're all going to now sign in on this one.
Thanks, Jane, for helping get everyone over. I appreciate it.
I hope everybody else makes it.
So, Jim, if you're going to present, yeah, that's looking great. All right, so I think we're all here, and Jim is just getting going. I just did my little welcome and turned it over. And just for folks who are just joining us, we're glad to have you. And if you could also mute your mics so we can reduce the background noise. I will open up the chat box later in the presentation for participants to contribute questions. And I think we look like we're about ready to go. So thanks again to everybody.
Okay, I can start, Elena.
Please do.
All right. So again, I'm Jim Murphy. I have a couple of intro slides. Oh, there we go. So this is a strange looking picture. As you can see on the bottom, it's backwards, but it says Times, and it's actually the old New York Times building. So I grew up in New York City. My father worked for the Times his whole career. I worked there all during high school and college, cleaning offices, driving trucks, et cetera, I did go to Woodstock in 1969. I think it's a very important thing to know. Not that it made any big difference in my life. The Beatles had already changed my life early on. I certainly like music these days, as I hope everyone does, music of different kinds. I'm also somewhat of a political, I collect buttons and I go to a lot of meetings. There we have Elizabeth Warren for Senate down there. There's that Stairway Down is a Mitt Romney thing. I have my grandsons are now living with us for a while, and they said, how come there's all these Republicans? And I said, because I got buttons from everybody that I could. The earliest ones I got were from the Nixon Lodge. I didn't have any Kennedy ones because my parents were Republicans. I'm also in a band, the Hazardous Constituents. We play fairly regularly. Unfortunately, our St. Patrick's gig this year was canceled because of the coronavirus. We were going to also play an Earth Day gig, which is now also being canceled. So, oh, and here's a picture of me when I first got to EPA. So I started in EPA in 1997, January. And this was an award photo for getting a landfill built at Fort Devens, which is in parts of 4 towns.
Yesterday and clicked on that link, and it brought us back to the same page here. Okay.
Is that somebody else talking? Can you still see my picture?
Yeah, we can see it. So I'll just again ask if you are able to mute your microphone. That would be great. Thank you.
So anyway, I guess my hair was not as white then. And now I have a couple of quick photos. So I love working with community groups, and oftentimes, as what happened in this was in Stratford, Connecticut, and it was also a landfill issue that we had worked for 10 years with a group of dedicated citizens around this landfill, and finally it come to some agreement. But during that period, we had ignored all the newcomers to town, so all of a sudden there was a new group that was opposing our the action that we had planned to take to clean up the Raymark Industries Superfund site. Here's another one. This was another group in Stratford, SAFE. Stratford, Action for the Environment, it says right there. Here's some little thing a little bit more familiar, an HRI bumper sticker. The message is very clear there, except for clean your PCBs from the rest of our river, but it doesn't say where you're going to put these PCBs, which is one of the big questions at hand. This one, keep Housatonic real. I don't even know who put this out, and I'm not even sure what it means, but the Housatonic is certainly real. So anyway, I'm going to talk about a little bit of the history of the cleanup, and because this class initially, or this lecture initially was for the students at the college, and my plan was to talk about the problems that were created in Pittsfield by the GE facility dumping PCBs for many, many years, and then the steps that were taken and the progress that was made. But in recent days, the last month, there was a settlement agreement announced amongst a group of stakeholders, and it hasn't been all that well received, although I think generally, that's up to the receiver to make that decision. But anyway, and I don't want to get into too many technical details, just knowing who's on the call and all of this history, but PCBs were, since the early 1900s, GE operated a large-scale industrial facility, including manufacturing and service of power transformers, aerospace, meaning essentially ordnance, plastics, and used numerous chemicals at their Pittsfield facility. So from 1932 through 1977, they manufactured and serviced electrical transformers containing PCBs. Years of PCB industrial use and improper disposal led to extensive contamination around the city of Pittsfield, as well as down the entire length of the Housatonic River. The Housatonic River, by the way, is approximately 150 miles from its headwaters on the East Branch in Hinsdale, Mass., which is north of Pittsfield, and it flows through Connecticut after gets through Massachusetts and then eventually to Long Island Sound. So PCBs, polybiphenyl, oh boy, polychlorinated biphenyls. I never say that, what I always say is PCBs. But, you know, upon learning of the chemicals' ability to harm wildlife and human health, EPA banned production of PCBs in 1979, I believe, the late 70s it was. And all of a sudden there was many PCBs to clean up, not only in Pittsfield, but throughout the country. And a lot of these sites were very large sites and presented many challenges. In our region, Region 1, I'll keep saying our region, so let me make that clear. I meant to say that during my intro. Is I used to work for EPA. I no longer work for EPA. So anything I am saying is my view of things. It is not an EPA position. I retired last April. I'm coming on up on my first anniversary. Retirement has been difficult, you know, moving away from the everyday working at sites and dealing with people. But yeah, all in all, it's pretty good. Anyway. So we had a couple of the and I'll try to keep saying, well, I'll say EPA, but EPA had some other major sites in our region, which are the 6 New England states. New Bedford Harbor, which I think is probably our largest site, which is a PCB site. Also, there were 2 companies that operated their facilities right along the harbor, and they dumped PCBs into the harbor for decades. Raymark Industries, which is known primarily as an asbestos site, but was also a very heavily contaminated with PCBs, and that's in Stratford, Connecticut. Anyway, moving back to Pittsfield, after testing the groundwater, the river sediment, the soil, and the wildlife, it was clear that there was a lot of contamination that needed to be addressed. PCBs don't readily break down in the environment. If left untouched, they would continue to pose a risk, and so that's not what we're about to do. And I think Elena had initially asked me to talk a little bit more about PCBs, but I think knowing who's on the call so far, I'm not going to do a whole lot about that. The buildup of PC levels within animals is known as bioaccumulation. Animals meaning fish, mammals, etc. They don't break down quickly. Once consumed, they're carried up the food chain. Health effects from PCBs have been linked to cancer and other serious effects on the immune system, reproductive system, nervous system, and other organs. They are not good things. Although, a little aside, GE along the ways, the recently departed Jack Welch said that there were no problems with PCBs, that they were safe. But let me get back to my thought process. And, you know, the EPA's concern was that people came in contact with them, either by touching them in the river and the sediment or consuming the fish from the areas in the Housatonic River. So EPA was going to move ahead. Getting back to the slide here, there was a consent decree approved by the court, and a consent decree is just a legal agreement, and it's kind of outside some of the regular EPA Superfund process. But anyway, that's what governs this whole project moving forward since 2000. And initially it addressed 20 cleanup areas associated with the large facility in Pittsfield. And it called for all of those to be cleaned up in addition to the river in 3 stages. The first 1.5 mile reach was cleaned up by GE in 1999 through 2002. The next 1.5 mile reach was cleaned up by EPA 2002 to 2007. And during that period, GE was cleaning up the floodplain along the river. So it was a very cooperative effort, working with all the residents and the businesses along those stretches of the urban river going through Pittsfield. but EPA picked up the tab for that mile and a half reach. That was all part of the deal in the first consent decree. Unfortunately, there was not enough data about the rest of the river, so that was only a process that was agreed upon under the permit. And I won't spend too much time on this figure, but it essentially shows in green the 20 areas now that have been cleaned up by GE and EPA. Primarily, GE does most of the work, and EPA oversees it. So in these non-river cleanup areas, and I put these slides in because I think people were interested in where this stuff is going and where it went. And a little bit under 200,000 cubic yards of soil and sediment were removed from these areas. A fair amount of cleanup property has been transferred to Pittsfield PETA, Economic Development Authority. And here I was just doing a number of pictures of what GE essentially looked like at the time. So on that map that I just skipped right by, it had a little bit of information. These are the 30s, the 40s, the 20s. So the buildings were all named. So this is building 31W. So that was one of the 30s. This building was in the same area. This is pretty much what it looks like today. Those GE buildings are gone. I'm not sure if that's the Berkshire. No, I guess that is a bank or a financial institution. Here's some of the 40s buildings. This is a current building that's still a GE. That's GE sold to General Dynamics Defense Systems, and they still manufacture various defense type components there. The upper 2 miles of the river, so the cleanup's been complete. 18,400 cubic yards of material was removed. During the mile and a half reach, another a little bit under 100,000 was removed. And what the good nugget to take out of this is the post-remediation sampling, which is done on a very regular basis. It's all available to the public, has just shown a great reduction in the levels of PCB contaminations in the sediments. So I just threw in a couple of pictures here of how the river was cleaned in Pittsfield. And you can see a pretty large piece of equipment down there on the left. On the far left is the river. So the river was divided in some of the sections by that, I forget what that steel stuff is, the steel pilings that you put in there. But it was done pretty dramatically. All the trees from one bank or both banks were cleared. A lot of people complained, well, it's just an urban ditch. It used to be such a beautiful place. And, we destroyed the river to clean it. That was one of GE's refrains that they mentioned numerously later on. But as you can see in this picture, the free-flowing river is on the right. The work is being done on the left. And you can see that house kind of in the middle of the screen. That will appear in a number of these pictures. I just put this one in because there was some very heavily contaminated sediments, and this was the the area much closer to the GE facility. So those were being stockpiled there so they could be disposed of. So here you still see that house. You see a drill rig. You see the free-flowing river on the left and the work that been done on the right. This is getting later now. This is even into the early into the next year where that whole area is being completed. Now you can see that this whole left side of the river is where the work is happening, and the river was flowing on the right. This is a picture. I'm not sure. Let me just go back and see. So that was 2000. So this February to May, and so the work was completed at that point. All that rock is called riprap, and that was put in there on top of the cap. And the other thing, the river was excavated as much as possible in some spots, but then there was a cap, and it was kind of a hard cap, concrete pieces almost like you would see that go into a driveway, when you see those pieces, people who have those little puzzle-looking driveways. I'm not sure what it is called. Obviously, I'm not a technical person, but I have a pretty good idea of what happened out there. Okay, so this is a picture. We're skipping now like 12 years, and this is the same area. And again, as you go back and see that all the trees were gone, you can see all the little plantings along the river where the trees and the other native plants were planted in May of 2000, and then we skipped 13 years. And we do have pictures, or EPA has pictures of various points during this period so that you can see how the restoration happened. So there's just a couple more of these. I am not sure if this is looking from that same bridge where the White House was or looking at the other direction. Anyway, there's also groundwater contamination, and that's being addressed by GE. There's monitoring, there is interim monitoring going on, long-term monitoring. But I mean, I think the bottom line there is over 1 million gallons of oil has been removed from the groundwater and transported off-site for disposal. That raises the question, is like, how much is in there? And that's been a point of contention. For many years, GE provided some information initially. A number of GE employees then provided much different information, much higher estimates of the amount of PCB oil that was that was leaked at the site and made its way to the river. So I don't think we have a good idea of that, but that's not something we want to really focus on. What we want to focus on, or what EPA wants to focus on, is just addressing what we can in the river right now. Again, the disposal, off-site disposal from those first parts of the site work at the facility and the river, almost 300,000 cubic yards of sediment. And part of it went off-site, 127,000 cubic yards, and a good part of it was deposited in 2 landfills that are right near the Allendale School, and that's been also another bone of contention, I would say, for many years. People saying that, there's not a worse place to build a landfill than next to a middle school, elementary school. The issue is that, or not the issue, but the circumstance was that the landfill was there before the school, at least the first landfill. And as part of the consent decree in 2000, the deal was struck that for GE to get started on all this work, that they were going to be able to dispose of additional material at one of the landfills, and then to create a new kind of state-of-the-art landfill. I know that's a term that a lot of people don't think much of, but with the best technology at the time to engineer a landfill that could be as safe as possible. So that was the Building 71 OPCA. And OPCA, it means on-plant consolidation area. So it's kind of funny how EPA and other folks who are working with landfills don't call them dumps. They don't even call them landfills. There's always another name, like the on-plant consolidation area. When we're talking about the current landfill site that's being proposed at the Lane Construction in Lee, we're calling that, or EPA is calling that, an upland disposal facility. But essentially, people in the community say these are dumps. And that's what they are, but they're very controlled. And this is just a graphic to show you. The top of the graphic is the Allendale School. And you can see that there's the Allendale School cap is really over the whole, all of that area was excavated. So initially the school had been part of a farm. The land was donated to the city to build the school. The city then took, they wanted to fill in the area, so they took soil from Hill 78, the landfill consolidation. What was Hill 78, which was the current dump area, and they used that to fill in the school. Later on, when testing was done in the 80s and then the 90s, it was realized that that was contaminated, so it was taken back up from the Allendale schoolyard and put back onto Hill 78, which was then filled with construction debris as well as other contaminated soils and sediments from the facility cleanup as well as the river cleanup. Building 71, well, previously there had been a Building 71 there. This is a photo of the construction of the lined landfill that was constructed there, where the higher levels of PCB contaminants were placed. And on the left of that picture, you can see what is that power plant, and I think I have a picture of that coming up. You can see it up on the right now. But this is, so that first picture is basically the bottom liner. It eventually was filled with waste, and now you can see it's all on the right is the final cap. Here it is again, looking from the top. And here's so this is the power plant that was built. I don't know if it's P&G. I'm not even sure which utility owns it now. It had been, I believe, a GE power plant, but they sold it. And when people look at Hill 78 from the school, this is really what they see. They see the green mound in front of it, but then they see this pretty scary looking building. So that doesn't really help for calming people's nerves about what a great place it is not to have a school. And year after year, and again, this is a common theme in these long-term cleanups, is that EPA has sampled done air monitoring, air sampling around the Allendale School for years and years, since when the on-site landfills, the OPCAs, were being utilized and filled and then capped. And since then, for many years. And again, we hear stories at some of the meetings that, it's such a dangerous place for kids to be, and, they're breathing PCB air all the time, and this is unacceptable, and it's a great reason for not having another landfill anywhere in Berkshire County. So what this slide is showing is that in this not past year, but to the summer of 2008, the Allendale School was sampled again. I don't know if it's an annual sampling now, or it's maybe twice a year. It may be annual. But there were a number of people in Great Barrington around Rising Pond who had been very upset that, they had heard that there's high PCB levels in the air because of living near the river. And that's something that's come up at many, many, many meetings, is that, EPA initially said, don't worry about the volatilization or the PCBs, coming off the sediment and out of the river or into the air. And I think that's been pretty much debunked, that actually does happen. But kind of the summary of this slide, and I took this from an EPA presentation back in 2018 at the CCC meeting, the Citizens Coordinating Council, which, for anyone who doesn't know, is a group that met very regularly, monthly for years now. It really meets essentially quarterly, but is a group of citizen activists, as well as representatives from a lot of the environmental advocacy groups in the area. It has some other community representation. There's not as much business representation as there once was, but it was an effort to really get a cross section of people who were impacted by the whole GE Pittsfield Housatonic site, and to get them use it as a way to get information out to the community and to get feedback from the community on a regular basis. Over the years, the early years, or the first 10 years, most of the action was in Pittsfield. So one of the things that happened is a lot of people from the South County, the towns down there really didn't participate much because they didn't really feel that what was going on impacted them directly. But anyway, the bottom line on this is that it shows that, for the Allendale School, the PC concentrations in the air are much below the EPA standards. So a notification action level, what that is if we hit that kind of level, there's a problem. The work has to stop, and EPA and GE have to figure out how to change what they're doing to stop the PCB PCBs from volatilizing into the air. And the screening level is a lower level, and if that shows up, then that's before you would get to the action level. But that's something, when we see a screening level, it's okay, we really need to see what's going on. We don't have to stop work, but we have to figure out why the levels are that high. And as you can see from Allendale School, 2007 to 2018, the concentrations were 100 times below the notification level and 10 times below the screening level. And then in 2018, they were even lower. But the sampling that we did at Rising Pond, and when we did that, there was one citizen who really drove it down there, but he contacted me and asked if I would contact a number of the businesses around the lake. There's I forget the name of a bar that's right on the lake, the Grill Tavern or something. There is a bakery, I don't know if it's called Berkshire Bakery or whatever, that has really good bread, by the way. They were right on the river. There's a farm that is right on the river. So I went around and talked with all of the the owners and the employees at those places and said, there's a concern that there's high levels of PCB in the air, and we know there probably are PCBs in the air because this Rising Pond has not been addressed yet, and it's kind of at the bottom of the river where when there is a cleanup, it may be the last thing taken care of. But we did the sampling, and we found out that again the levels were below the project action levels and below the national screening levels, but they were actually higher than they were around Allendale School, where the remediation had already happened. So I think that is evidence that yes, there are PCBs in the air, and this job really has to get done. And we try to get that message out with people who are saying, well, let's not do anything until we have it, figured out, until we have some kind of technology that can deal with it without just having to excavate it all and bring it to a dump either across the country or in Berkshire County. So in conjunction with all the work that was being done in Pittsfield, there was investigation of the river, and there were many samples in the sediment in the floodplain and the biota, the fish and the other critters were done. As a result of those, there were some risk assessments, a human health risk assessment, an ecological risk assessment. There was modeling done used to predict the movement of PCBs through the river. And all of those activities were done in conjunction with GE, and they were peer reviewed. That was one of the things that GE got out of the consent decree, is that they would, if EPA did this work, was the lead on the risk assessments, then GE would have the opportunity to bring in experts of their choosing along with experts at EPA's choosing and evaluate what was done. And essentially the bottom line that came out of it is that there is a serious problem for human health and the ecosystem in the river. And when that happened, GE kind of knew that they were on the hook. Well, they already knew they were on the hook, but they thought they were going to be able to wriggle off a little bit. But it was very clear to their leadership at the time. Steve Ramsey was their lead person. He had worked at the Department of Justice for 15, 18 years. He was kind of their lead environmental enforcement person, so he knew exactly what it meant. And I'm getting onto a little bit of a tangent, but what happened after that was GE, in a couple of instances, tried to get EPA to move away from the consent decree and to negotiate something outside that. EPA was pretty clear during that period that, no, we have the consent decree. We like the way it's set up. You know, the decisions need to be based on good science and within the parameters that were all agreed to by everybody, and we want to stick to that, because there were a couple of political events that tried to get beyond that, but none of them did succeed. So here's the areas covered by the rest of the river. Not a great slide, but essentially it shows Pittsfield all the way down to Long Island Sound. And once you get past the south of the Massachusetts-Connecticut border, the data did not indicate that there was any active remediation that was needed. Most of the PCBs are in the section of the river between the confluence, Fred Garner Park in Pittsfield, down about 10 miles to Woods Pond, like 90% or so. I don't remember the exact numbers. But by the time, you know, and there are a number of or levels of measurable levels of PCB going over the Woods Pond Dam in Lenox and Lee. And then the other measurement that was taken on a regular basis is what was going over Rising Pond Dam in Great Barrington. And the whole cleanup essentially those were one of the metrics that were very important, is that the cleanup is going to be done so that the PCB levels going over those dams are decreased dramatically, like close to 90% if possible, and that the PC levels in the fish would also be decreasing over time. So this is just a little bit more of a close-up of the area in Pittsfield going down into Lenox and Lee, where most of the work is going to happen. Beyond this, there are some downstream impoundments. I probably have a slide where there'll be removal of sediment behind those dams. I don't need to go through these alternatives, but these are all the alternatives that we looked at. Essentially were balanced and had to meet these basic criteria: overall protection of human health and the environment, control the sources of releases, compliance with other federal and state laws that are applicable. And just to give you an idea, there were a whole bunch of metrics that we use in evaluating the alternatives, but some of them were, the projected fish tissue concentrations in Woods Pond, and those were all based on this modeling and risk assessment stuff that had happened. So, GE knew that the bad news was coming for them. Another metric was how much of the floodplain would be remediated, the flux over Woods Pond and Rising Pond that I also mentioned. And then again, when the river floods, how much PCBs come out of the river and into the floodplain, and how much they move around, etc. This is one thing I think that's interesting for people in general, is the floodplain area. So this is not the river itself, but the floodplain next to it. And you can see it's in the yellow, and I believe that's the 100-year floodplain. And each one of these 90 areas, it was divided up into 90 areas based on how it was used. And there were a lot of interviews and observations made, with these areas that are frequented by the public, canoe launches, campers, hunters, whatever the case may be. So each exposure area will be cleaned up to a different level. It depends on how it was used as to how many feet of contaminated soil will have to come out of it. So this is just a big puzzle. There are actually on EPA's website, which I think I'll have later in the presentation, but it's epa.gov//GE-Housatonic. Each one of these has a tile, and they're all very accessible on the web. And each one of those tiles is going to show all the sampling that was done in that exposure area, how deep the samples went, what the PCB concentrations were at a half a foot, a foot and a half, all the way down to 6-7 feet in some cases. I'm going to skip that for now. And I wanted to get back just to, I think that's kind of the cleanup thing that I was trying to cover, and I'm not sure how much time I have left. Hopefully longer than 10 minutes since we started 15 minutes late. But and let me see if I can get stop sharing my screen. End of slideshow. Click to exit. Okay. Can you all see me again?
I think we can all see you, and if folks have that same sort of large dark area and it says hide stage, if you click hide stage, that will bring up Jim, and also if you click in the upper right, you can pick a layout, and if you want to see him bigger, you can click on speaker view.
So anyway, I wanted to get out that's kind of the history, but where we are today is, and I do have some of the slides, but I would probably rather talk through it at this point, that there was, in 2014, EPA put forth a permit, and that's, it's essentially the cleanup plan. And it included, cleanup of the river, the floodplains, the banks of the river, the erodible banks. There had been a lot of studies about how much, what the levels of PCBs were or are in the banks, and how often those banks, are liable to fall into the river and spread the contamination around. So there were just a lot of components. But the bottom line, I think, that people are interested in these days is our decision was appealed by a number of parties, I believe, 5 parties. Most of them were had things about the cleanup. There wasn't enough cleanup. We didn't look at alternative technologies enough, a couple of different things. All of those appeals essentially were the Environmental Appeals Board, which is an EPA kind of court, essentially agreed with EPA, saying, no, that cleanup, that's justified. GE is the one who opposed most of the, they came up with the longest briefs for the Environmental Appeals Board. And during the process, this whole consent decree process since 2000 was done under, not under Superfund, but under a thing called RCRA, Resource Conservation Recovery Act, and it's just another, a bunch of regulations that a company would have to follow to do a cleanup as opposed to Superfund, but it gives the responsible party a lot more opportunity to appeal things. And during all of those years of cleaning up not only the facility, but then a lot of the stuff that was done during the river investigation, General Electric was able to contest it. And, we'd have a dispute resolution process. We would, come to some kind of formal agreement where we could move on. But they had dozens and dozens of things that they had contested over the years, and those could all be appealed when we finally get to this appeals process. But they actually did narrow their appeal down to probably 13 or 15 specific kind of big things. But all of those were pretty much upheld, except for EPA had included off-site disposal to licensed out-of-state facilities. And the Environmental Appeals Board, essentially said, you really didn't convince us, EPA. You really didn't make your case. And knowing that there were many other EPA landfills around, or Superfund sites around the country where landfills were created in not the perfect spots, but that we could waive some kind of requirements if the responsible party took additional steps when they were constructing it. GE said, of course, we're going to do that. We shouldn't have to spend $250 million extra to ship this to some other landfill in Indiana or Michigan or Utah or Texas, no place very close. And that, we have a couple of different locations in Berkshire County that we think would be appropriate. Anyway, so essentially, they said to us, you got to go back and make a better case for the landfill, for shipping this stuff out and not having a landfill. And I think, me as an EPA person, and again, I'm speaking as a private citizen now, I had worked on numerous other sites where, landfills with high levels of contamination were built or even added to, even if they didn't have liners and so on. And it was like, really, we've been telling people in these other places they need to have a local landfill because this is where the stuff is and came from, and a lot of it's already here. And why are we going to pick it all up and a taxpayer money, if we're doing it under Superfund money with no responsible party, pay extra hundreds of millions of dollars of your money to move it someplace else when it would be just as protected here? So anyway, I kind of like to think of it as landfill phobia, kind of AKA not in my backyard type of thing. Some people are afraid of dogs or cats or spiders or heights. I don't really like going high places. Flying, riding in an elevator, claustrophobic, all kinds of fears. I mean, with the coronavirus engulfing us all now, I'm kind of convinced that germs seem like a good thing to maybe be concerned about. But anyway, most of us have some kind of superstition or phobia about something. But I think, I'm kind of seeing this phobia about sending low levels of PCBs to a local landfill when the same levels and worse are currently in the air and in the river where people actually live, work, or go to school. And the idea that it would be better to just keep them in the river as opposed to taking them out and putting them in a controlled, engineered, well-monitored landfill, that'd be that's not a good idea. Now, some of it I think is back from the Allendale, the Allendale school, but I think I kind of went through that I think, the Allendale school levels are lower than the levels in other parts along the river. And just as I was thinking about landfills, something I really like to think about, when I was a kid, I used to go up to the Catskills every summer. I started going up there when I was about 8 years old. And one of the big thrills was going to the Ulster County dump once a week. We were in an area where there were 10 summer cabins, and the owners loaded all the trash into a big trailer, and we went to the dump. It was such a treat. And what the dump was, the person backed the trailer into a smoldering area of the landfill because all the garbage was being burned. And we got to be in the trailer and throw all the trash out onto the pile that was going to be burned soon. But then the guy who was driving the trailer usually let us have about 15 minutes going to break bottles, ash-covered bottles that we found in the areas that were cooled off because the bottles usually didn't burn. But anyway, that was, as time went on, I probably only went there for about 3 years doing this, but there were also, appliances, machinery, construction debris, windows you could break, all that type of thing. And everybody called it a dump. Later it was called a landfill, and eventually it was the transfer station. But, that was my idea of a landfill until I got to EPA. And then I found these landfills that were these huge hunks of land that I just thought were mountains when I was passing them by, 80-acre landfills and so on. And I started working on a lot of them. And just to mention a couple of them where I think it's similar circumstances is there's a Nyanza Superfund site in Ashland, Massachusetts, which was a very large landfill. There was mercury contamination there, and the landfill had been built and constructed, but part of it was that there were some other areas in town that needed to be cleaned, and there was no EPA money at the time, so it had to wait 10 years. But when they constructed the landfill, they actually built an area of it with clean soil, a separate cell. So when EPA eventually got to cleaning up the waste in these wetland areas down the hill from the landfill, they would have a place to put it. They could use that clean soil as backfill or other places around the site. And again, people were a little bit freaked out about having a landfill and, right in their town, and now putting more stuff into it. And what EPA and the state and the Army Corps of Engineers did is we essentially organized tours of the landfill, like on a weekly basis. And a tour would include a history of the contamination, kind of a controlled visit to observation areas around the excavation that were, roped off so people could see what was happening. A hike around the landfill to view the different components and to see where the waste was being placed. There were two nearby schools, and they participated. They were the ones we started the tours from, and then we actually ran them from probably May through September, when eventually we had one and nobody showed up because I think everybody in town had already been on one of the tours. And again, it made a big difference for people in the community. They can actually see what we were doing and not have this mystery of, there's going to be some dangerous landfill up there. And it definitely is, a dangerous landfill. It contaminated the groundwater. There are about 50 homes just down the hill from the landfill that we had to install vapor mitigation systems in because the groundwater was contaminated by solvents in addition to the mercury contamination in the sediments. So an idea that I got by going to that landfill or thinking about that landfill where a cell was set aside to later come back to put more waste in is that, when if a local landfill is built in the Lane Construction gravel pit, it could be constructed with some cells with contaminated sediment and soils that could then be accessed for alternative technology, pilot projects, et cetera. And again, just, making the landfill not such a mystery to people, inviting schools to come up there, not when there's active work going on. Although in some of the cases in Nyanza, we did take people up when active work was going on. We were just further enough away and we were in a good observation place where you could see what was going on. Another site that very similar again was the Raymark Industry site in Stratford, Connecticut. And that again, we worked with the community group there for 10 years. They wanted everything shipped out of town, and I think I'd mentioned this before, and we said EPA can't do that. The state of Connecticut was very insistent because when there's a Superfund remedy, the state is responsible for, oh boy, I'm blanking on the percent that they're responsible to pay. I don't know if it's 10 or 20 or whatever, but if it was going to be 100 million more, it was going to cost them, 20 million more, and they really didn't want to deal with that. And there was an appropriate place in town that was right next to the facility that had been a ball field. Raymark had deposited well over 100,000 cubic yards of waste there, and this is PCBs, asbestos, and just a whole cocktail of chemicals. And we worked with the RAC, Raymark Advisory Committee. We ran into a problem about 10 years later when we had also all come to a kind of a compromise where we're actually going to leave some stuff in place and cap it, and then use 2 landfill locations in town. And it blew up because there were a fair, EPA and DEP had been so concentrated on working with this kind of inside group of people, a lot of people who actually abutted the potential landfill area, that we kind of lost track of all the new people who were moving into town. And all of a sudden, there was, a panic by all new people who, we had not educated about history and what was going on and what we were doing. And it took an effort by Gina McCarthy, who had been the Mass DEP, or I think it's called DEEP now, commissioner, and then she later became the EPA administrator, and that's when Kurt Spaulding was our administrator, and they all got together, and it was because there was a mayor in Stratford. John Harkins was his name. He had been a state rep for years and had always been opposed to having a landfill there. But when he became the mayor for a 4-year term, as soon as after he got in there, he called me up and said, how do we proceed on this thing now? We want to have this, we want to move this. We want to get this whole Raymark thing behind us. And I said, well, it's not, easier said than done. But, we first need to work with the small group of citizens and explain what we think should be done and why we should do it, because most of these citizens had also been working on it for 10 or 15 years, and people get a little bit tired of that. And I think I'm going to, before moving on to other ones, and I want to be aware, Elena, that I don't just keep babbling on before Q&A, but I think, the kind of the key from my experience to solving like difficult environmental problems is you need trust with the community, and sometimes we lose that, and it's hard to get it back. When there is a trust problem, we need the ability to bring in independent technical advisors, third-party people who can say, yes, EPA is totally off the wall on this, or yes, we agree with EPA that this makes sense. It takes a lot of time. It takes years to solve some of these difficult, controversial sites. Personalities matter. You can have a couple of real jerks, either at the agency or in the community, or elected officials who can screw things up. And I have many stories about that I will not go into at the moment. But, when there's a change in personnel, a lot of times that makes a world of difference. And then I think the last thing, and I kind of mentioned John Harkins in this, was the local leadership and just elected officials coming out that have the courage to support what they think is fact-based, science-based information, even though they know, many people in their communities are going to be against them. And I think that's what we've seen in the South County towns now, with a couple of the members of the Board of Selectmen who worked on this municipal committee. They weren't thrilled about this in the first place, but I think working together with EPA, and GE came in only after a while, but going along the personalities matter type of thing, is that the leadership at GE changed. We've had the problem of maintaining constant communication with the community. It also applies to the agencies, the teams that are in place, and the new political leaders that come in. In Massachusetts with GE, we've gone through, Governor Weld was in there when this first started back in '97, and I think Trudy Cox was the Secretary of Environmental Affairs. Then we went into Paul Cellucci for 4 years with Bob Durand, Governor Swift, Governor Romney. When Governor Patrick came in, he brought in a bunch of politicians who were not scientists, and really it did not help. They were more susceptible to GE's tricks, is how I would say it. GE essentially said, hey, wouldn't it be nice if we could have just a much smaller cleanup. We'll put up some fish advisory signs. We won't really have to worry about a landfill. We're not going to take that much out of the system, and we'd be happy to ship that off. And now we have Governor Baker. So anyway, I think my point was that, the changing personalities, and I think one of the key ones here is GE. We had GE's leader was Steve Ramsey, the president of Environment, Health and Safety for 15 years or something, and he worked with John DeVillas, our first regional administrator. they kind of came to at least they came to a deal and moved forward. Of course, everybody, that's a consent decree from 2000. Everybody didn't agree on it. And then we had a number of years there where things were going okay, but after that, risk assessments came out, and Ramsey was like, uh-oh, I think we lost, and he kind of left GE right after that. And we got Ann Klee, and Ann Klee had been general counsel of EPA for a couple of years under George Bush, the second Bush. And so she definitely knew the EPA rules and personalities and politics, et cetera, et cetera. But she was a little bit more of a hard person to deal with. She wasn't gentle. I'm just watching my characterizations. But, I think her attitude was like, hey, the law is on our side. We don't have to do anything extra. We're not going to worry about compensating those towns or doing anything to make them happy, because all we have to do was the minimum requirement. And that kind of went on through a number of attempts to mediate and get together, et cetera, et cetera. And really only recently she left, she left GE, but she essentially lost, she spent less time on Housatonic. She was, became in charge of their move to Boston, et cetera, et cetera. And then this guy, Roger Martella, came along. Roger was also a general counsel for EPA under Bush, I think after Ann Klee, but he is just a much different person. He comes into a meeting, he's willing to listen, he's willing to compromise, and I think he wanted to get something done. Having watched Ann Klee for 10 years essentially get nothing done, that was probably not what was going through his mind. But again, being able to deal with somebody and having somebody from GE able to talk to the communities that they could trust again. And, the people in the Berkshires had a lot of respect for the the GE technical people over the years, who came to the community meetings on a regular basis and answered questions and made presentations and admitted when they made mistakes, and were just genuine people as well as very competent engineers. And, a couple of years ago, they pulled, and again, this is under Ann Klee, they pulled all those people out, saying that they don't have to waste their time, coming to the community meetings. So anyway, I think I should probably try to wrap it up. I had like several more similar situations that I wanted to talk about. And I really did want to talk about them because this is not a unique situation. And it happens in a lot of places around the country. But what, no side has a monopoly on the facts here, but the citizens who have been involved here, I have the greatest respect for. They have given their lives for the last 10, 15, 20 years to work on this whole project. And now, the thing I think is a little bit unfair is that, but unfair is not the right word, but that there are new citizens coming onto the scene who really know very little about the history and so on. And, they're saying, okay, we're going to stop the dumps, we can chain ourselves to the bulldozers and so on. And it's like, well, that's, in my personal opinion, that is not the hard work. Somebody can lay down in front of a bulldozer, they'll be arrested, they'll be put in jail, they'll be out on bond, they probably are not going to do it another time. It really doesn't work. They'll get, they'll be in the media for a day or so, but their critical job is not over when a decision is made. What the citizens, and I'd like, hopefully EPA and other citizens can get this across to people, that there's really a role for people going forward. Yes, if there is going to be a landfill here, it can be much better if, there's oversight and cooperation working with the towns and GE and watching over the stuff that's done. It's the government works better when people are watching and people are involved. Local groups to monitor the construction, the operation, and press for alternative technology. That's something that EPA in this new improved version is promising that EPA will actively pursue alternative technology. And I think that's something that has really soured the community over the years, that EPA made some commitments, 10 years ago or so, that we're going to be actively pursuing alternative technology, and it really didn't happen that anybody in the community could see. And I think two other things that I keep hearing that I just wanted to mention before I wrap up is that, one of the things that I've been hearing at meetings, because I actually have gone to a couple of public meetings because I am kind of hooked on them. For 45 years, I've been doing this. I love public meetings. I love controversy. You don't have to pay to go to a public meeting and hear people, talk about their positions with passion and intelligence and great knowledge. There are so many self-taught citizen scientists out there. But one of the things that comes all the time is property values. You're wrecking our property values. And it's like, wait a second, it's the Stop the Dumps group out there that it's saying you're going to die if you live out here, that are, creating the whole, all the negative information. Obviously the realtors aren't doing it, and people should be responsible when they're moving into an area to do some investigation. I tell numerous people at numerous sites that I don't really feel sorry for them because they moved in next to a toxic waste site. Like, don't they have any common sense? They didn't do their due diligence, and don't blame me. And, it's not my fault or not EPA's fault. We're here trying to fix the problem, and you didn't have to come here, but you did. And why don't you work with us and try to get something done? Or on the other hand, maybe you should, if you're not so attached to the community, you can sell now, because what's going to happen is probably not going to happen in a couple of years. But that's not an EPA position either, is to buy out or move out. But with some people who were extremely upset, they were scared by a lot of the misinformation out there, and they thought their kids' lives were endangered, just living in the area. And anyway, I encouraged those people to move out because I thought it was going to ruin their health, really. I made the judgment, I don't think you really can live here, because I've tried to give you all the accurate information, but if you're not hearing it, then, probably your best bet's to move out. The last thing, landfill liners and leaks. And we hear all the time, well, none of these landfills are forever. And that is certainly the case. I don't know, EPA doesn't put out anything saying, oh yeah, no problem. Landfill liners are going to leak eventually. Your roof is going to leak eventually. These landfills have to be maintained. There are problems eventually with leachate collection systems. The pipes can clog up. The liners can crack, or there were holes in them when they were installed. But at these engineered landfills, again, state of the art is there are duplicative monitoring systems to find out when there is a problem, and then those problems have to be fixed. And just like, some people live in a 2 or 300-year-old house is in pretty good shape, it's because it's been kept up. And that's kind of the story of the landfills. And I think I want to thank everybody for participating in this, and I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Jim. So what I have done is just open up the comment box. Depending on your computer, it might be on the left, it might be on the right. In any case, it's that typical little sort of comment blurb. And if you click on it, then it should allow for you to type in a question. And so I'll just type in your questions can go here, so that folks can hopefully see that. And if you can see where it says your questions can go here, I would invite anyone who has a question to enter their question in that little comment box. And then if we see some popping up, then Jim may be able to answer them. So Jim, what I see is that it says Jane and Bruce Wynn is typing a message. So that tells me there's some activity going on there. Do you have your comment box open, Jim?
I cannot see it.
Oh, okay.
I am trying to find.
You can take.
Oh, I think so. I think I see it now. I see your questions can go here. Yes.
Great. And so what I will also do is I believe that there are a few folks that are connected simply by telephone.
Mm-hmm.
And so for the folks that are connected just by telephone, I will see if I, let's see. Oh, I don't know if I can do anything about that. All right, so Jane and Bruce Wynn, BNRC brought up a good question. Are the current landfills monitored for groundwater near the Lane Quarry site?
Okay, so I do not know the answer to.
Whoops. So, sorry about that. You still there, Jim? Oh, hold on a second. Sorry. I think I was trying to unmute and I resulted in muting. Hold on one moment. Jim, unmute. All right, there, Jim. You should be unmuted. Sorry about that. Oh, I think, Jim, we still can't hear you. So, Jim, if there may be something that asks you to unmute yourself now.
Yeah,
okay. Great.
Okay.
Thank you. We're good. Sorry about that.
Okay, so the question is, are the current landfills, and that means there are two landfills near Lane. There is a paper mill landfill, and I believe I don't know if it's the Lennox landfill or the Lee landfill. One of them has solar panels on it. So I don't know the answer to it. My guess is those are regulated by the state, and I assume that there is some type of monitoring going on. I don't know how extensive their monitoring system would be. I mean, that's, people could potentially look at, a GE landfill going in there that's going to have an extensive monitoring network that maybe would pick up things from the other landfills. I believe part of the kind of enhanced remedy now is that GE will extend public water to some nearby homes, which is a boon, I think, because I don't know what the contamination situation is related to the other landfills, but it's a great question with a non-answer.
I'll invite anyone else who wants to ask anything. I'll also ask, Jim, I just had one question about the air quality data. And if you knew sort of, what I think the data that you presented were averages. Do you know how many samples were taken? I can imagine people asking, well, if those were averages, were there any individuals samples that were concerning? Did you have access to more of the data to be pretty confident that those averages are representative of conditions most of the time there?
Yes, and I don't have specific things right at my fingertips, but what I would encourage anybody to do is to go to that the GE website, which again is epa.gov/GE-Housatonic, and there is a section on that first page that comes up that's it's called Allendale School. If you click on that, it will have all of the air sampling data reports. It'll show the locations of the samplers. It has the time of the year, because I think they're less frequent than they were years ago. But all of that data is publicly available.
Thank you. And I just put a comment with the website that you just gave us, Jim, in case anyone wants to be able to follow that link.
Yes, and one, I don't know if it's a shortcut, but if you go to that, the website, and you can look under public meetings, and under public meetings there's another breakout that says, CCC meetings, public hearings, and if you look under CCC meetings, which is the Citizens Coordinating Council, The last meeting in 2018 is where the presentation was made, and it's probably 4 pages long, and it does have graphs and all of the data that you were referencing.
Thank you.
Okay. Allison Dixon, how heavily contaminated do you think the leachate from the landfill will be? That's another good question that is probably a little bit beyond me in that, again, I'm not a scientist, but I think what I can say about it is, it's going to be a controlled landfill. Like the EPA and GE and the community will know exactly what's going in there. It's PCB contamination at these certain levels. And now, I don't know what the plan is as far as how much dewatering has to happen before it goes into the landfill. I would guess a fair amount, because they don't want to put wet stuff in there. It's going to be, they're going to have to collect the leachate and then process that. I think there'll be an effort to not have, to dewater it as much as possible, but certainly there will be leachate coming out of it. And, depending on what the levels are, they're probably going to have to, I would assume, truck it back to Pittsfield to their water treatment facility, or if it's at certain levels, maybe it could go to one of the town wastewater treatment plants. I am not sure. So again, Elena, so will these questions be captured someplace?
So we're still recording. So
Okay.
if you read them off, then it'll still be part of this recording. Yep.
Right. Okay. Because I think, maybe somebody at EPA who knows more than I would be able to answer them. Okay. From Jane and Bruce, for the vernal pool at the end of Brunswick Road, when they remediated the vernal pool, did they save aside some of the leaf litter and then put it back in? I was surprised at how quickly the fairy shrimp came back. Well, both Jane and Bruce know so much more about fairy shrimp and vernal pools than and I don't know the answer to that question. I guess I haven't been able to answer any questions yet, but they're certainly very good questions. So I don't know if that's, I think, folks from Berkshire Environmental Action Team have worked on vernal pools more than the the one that's that they're referencing on Brunswick Road, and probably have an idea about best practices, which that's a little bit beyond my knowledge.
Thanks, Jim.
Jim, this is Charlie. I do have a question.
Mm-hmm.
If this landfill does come to be, and the agreement has the stipulation that in the future alternative technologies may be used to eventually essentially remove the landfill by cleaning up all of the contaminated whatever is put there.
Yep.
Could we then argue that the same should be done for Hill 78 and Hill 71 in Pittsfield?
Certainly you could argue it, but I think, the difference there would be that, what's going to be in Lane Construction Landfill, the gravel pit landfill, if that comes to pass, again, is very kind of consistent material. I don't know what's in Hill 78. That was a long time GE landfill, so who knows what they put in there, and what, if the same type of alternative technology that could be used at a new landfill with pretty consistent material could be then applied someplace else. I would think there would be some ability to do that. And also the levels, as I understand it, in the Building 71 landfill are of much higher levels than what's going to be put in the landfill in Lee.
Thanks,
you.
Jim. So I think that I'm not seeing anyone else typing now. And so I think at this point we will thank you, Jim, very much again for agreeing to do this and for taking the time to present and answer these questions. I will thank the attendees for participating and apologize again for the confusion. I will check over all those links for upcoming presentations and make sure that they are correct. And I hope that you will join us for the upcoming presentations as well. So thanks to everyone, and especially those of you on the call who've been participating with this issue for so long. We really appreciate it. So I think we'll sign off here. Thanks very much, Jim.
Thank you.
Always good to see you, Jim, even if it is this way.
Oh, I agree, Charlie. Hope to see you in person.
Okay.
Okay, take care.
Be well.